There are laughs that stay with you for years, not because they were funny, but because of what happened right after. Look at him, Diane said, tilting her wine glass toward me, loud enough for half the pavilion to hear. 30 years later, and he still shops at the same discount store he did in high school. The table around her laughed on cue. I didn't turn around right away. I just kept folding my napkin into a neat square, the way I do when I want my hands busy and my face calm. A man who's already won doesn't need to prove it in the moment somebody's trying to take something from him. Diane had just made the worst mistake of the last 3 decades of her life, and she didn't even know it yet. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 63 years old, and if you'd told me 2 years ago I'd be standing under string lights at my 40th high school reunion in Asheville, North Carolina, listening to my ex-wife mock the flannel jacket I was wearing, I'd have laughed and told you to find something better to do with your imagination. But there I was. The band was playing something slow and forgettable, the kind of song nobody dances to but everybody pretends to enjoy, and across the room stood the woman I'd been married to for 22 years, laughing at my jacket like it was the funniest thing she'd seen all decade. I want to say something before I go any further, son, because that's how I think of anybody listening to this, like a son or a daughter sitting across the porch from me, and it matters more than anything that happens later in this story. A man's worth was never supposed to be decided by a room full of people holding drinks. It's decided by what he does when nobody's applauding. My own father told me that on a Saturday morning when I was 14, both of us up to our elbows in engine grease in the garage behind our house in Hendersonville. I didn't understand it then. I understand it completely now. Diane didn't know what I'd built since she left. Nobody in that pavilion did. What they remembered was the version of me from 30 years back. A man who fixed appliances for a living and drove a truck with a cracked windshield he never got around to replacing. Apparently, in their minds, I was still that same man, still just getting by, while she'd gone on to marry money and build, from the look of the diamond on her hand, a whole new life for herself. Standing close beside her was a man in a suit that fit him the way an expensive suit fits somebody who bought it to be noticed rather than to be comfortable. His name, I'd learned soon enough, was Roland Griggs. What caught my attention first wasn't his face, it was where his eyes kept landing. Not on mine, on my hands. On the plain gold band I still wore on my right hand now, the one that used to belong to my own father, the one I moved fingers after Diane and I divorced instead of taking off entirely. Roland wasn't admiring it. He was doing arithmetic with it, the way a man does when he's deciding whether you're worth the effort of being polite to. Before I go further, I want you to sit with something my mother used to tell me on the back steps of our house in Hendersonville, snapping green beans into a bowl on her lap, a habit she kept up into her 80s. Walter, she'd say, the people who laugh loudest about where you started are usually the ones most afraid of where you might end up. She raised 5 of us on a seamstress's wages and a widow's pension, and I never once heard her raise her voice at another living soul. She used to say patience wasn't the same thing as standing still. It was moving forward so quietly that nobody noticed until you'd already arrived. She was right about almost everything in this life. She was right about this too. Let me take you back a little, because this is really where the story begins, not in that pavilion, but in a much quieter place, about 25 minutes before Diane found me. My old friend Carl had pulled me aside near the registration table, name tag already peeling off his shirt pocket, giving me the same look he'd been giving me for 2 weeks straight over the phone. You actually came, he said. I half expected you to turn that truck around in the parking lot. Considered it, I told him. Sat out there with the engine running for a good 10 minutes. Figured a grown man shouldn't need a pep talk to walk into a room full of people he graduated high school with 40 years ago, I said, which made him laugh, because we both knew that was exactly what I'd needed. Carl had been pushing me toward this reunion for weeks. We'd known each other since the 6th grade, and he had no patience left for my excuses. You've spent 2 years quietly putting your whole life back together, Walter, he told me over the phone the week before. Go to that reunion, not to prove anything to anybody. Go to close a door you never actually shut. I'd almost said no more than once. I had a good, quiet life by then, a small house at the edge of town with a porch I'd rebuilt myself, a woman who loved me steady and without conditions, and work that still mattered to people in this town, even if most of them never knew my name attached to it. I didn't need Diane's approval, or anybody else's from that gymnasium 4 decades back, to know who I was. But something in me wanted to walk into that room one more time, not as the man who'd been left behind, but simply as myself. Carl squeezed my shoulder once before drifting off towards some old classmates near the dessert table, and said the thing he always says before he leaves me to fend for myself in a crowded room. Just be yourself, Walter. That's always been more than enough, even on the days you didn't believe it. I was still turning that over in my mind, a cup of black coffee in hand, when Diane found me. We met at 17, both of us working the same summer at a hardware store off Cayuga Road. She ran the register. I stocked shelves and swept the back lot in 90-degree heat. She used to sneak me a cold soda from the break room when the owner wasn't looking, and I used to save her the good scraps of pine so she could build little wren houses she sold at the Saturday market downtown. She had a laugh back then, a real one, nothing performed about it, and I fell for her somewhere between the second soda and the fourth birdhouse. We dated 3 years before I asked her to marry me. We married at 20 in her family's little Baptist church, with maybe 50 people in the pews, and a reception afterward in the fellowship hall, with folding chairs and my mother's lemon cake. We stayed married 22 years through a genuinely good stretch, and then through a slower unraveling before she finally left. 22 years is a long time to build something with somebody. It's an even longer time to watch it come apart, one quiet disappointment at a time. The first 10 years were good, and I mean that honestly. Diane wanted things a bigger house, a certain kind of respect from people in town, the validation that comes from other folks being impressed by what you'd built. There's nothing wrong with wanting things. I wanted things too. But somewhere in our late 30s, the wanting curdled into something restless. No house was ever big enough. No raise I brought home ever quite satisfied her for long. I kept thinking the next thing would finally let her breathe easy. It never did. Eventually, I understood the peace she needed had to come from somewhere inside her, and I couldn't reach in and hand it to her, no matter how many extra shifts I picked up. There was the year I sold my father's old tool chest, the good hand-forged ones he'd used his whole working life to help cover a business course she wanted badly. I never told her what that cost me. Didn't want her carrying the weight of it. There was the year I turned down a shop manager position 2 counties over, better pay, real security, because she didn't want to leave Hendersonville while her mother was ailing. I said yes to staying without even hesitating. Picked up extra repair jobs on weekends instead, came home with grease under my nails, telling myself it didn't matter as long as she was content. I found out about the affair about a year before she finally left. I won't dwell on it, because it isn't really the point of tonight, and dwelling on old wounds never built a single thing worth having. I stayed anyway, because I believed if I was patient enough, steady enough, if I worked hard enough, she'd eventually look at what she already had and choose it. She didn't. On a Thursday morning 2 years ago, not decades, just 2 years, she packed a single suitcase and told me she'd already found a place across town. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching her zip it shut, the house so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. She didn't cry. Neither did I. Not then. Say something, she said, pausing at the door. Drive safe, I told her. Call me when you're settled so I know you got there all right. Okay, she said and left. I didn't chase her down the driveway. I let her go, and I went quiet. Folks mistake quiet for broken sometimes. They are never, ever the same thing. Now, our son Dale was already grown and settled in Charlotte by the time we split, so there wasn't any custody arrangement to navigate, no child caught between 2 houses. Small mercy, I suppose, though I still called him most Sundays those first months just to hear a familiar voice. Diane moved into a rental across town for about 8 months before she took a position in Charleston, closer, she told folks, to a fresh start and warmer winters. She met Roland Griggs less than 2 months after she'd unpacked her last box. Roland hadn't said a word to me directly yet, but he'd been watching the whole exchange between Diane and me with a kind of restless attention, like a man doing arithmetic he didn't want anybody catching him at. You're the ex, he finally said, extending a hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Roland, I'm in private lending, commercial mostly. Walter, I said, shaking once. Appliance repair, right? He said, like he was placing a confident bet at a card table. Diane mentioned you two go way back. Same graduating class. Same graduating class, I agreed. His eyes drifted again toward my hands, then briefly toward my boots, still good leather, but worn soft at the toe from years of standing on concrete floors. I watched him try to reconcile something in his head and fail, the way people do when the numbers in front of them refuse to add up to the story they'd already decided on. I didn't know it standing there, but Roland had a habit. He collected information the way some men collect old coins, not to spend it, but to know its worth on sight. Knowing the value of a thing quickly was, in his line of work, apparently a survival skill. What he didn't know was that the man standing in front of him in a flannel jacket had built something over the last 2 years that had nothing to do with dollars sitting in plain view, and everything to do with dollars sitting quietly where nobody thought to look. "We're engaged," Diane said, holding up her hand for anyone who hadn't already noticed the ring catching the string lights above us. 6 weeks now. Roland's built an incredible portfolio. Commercial properties, private lending, the whole operation. She said the word portfolio, like she was testing whether it might land a blow. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant the part where I hoped she'd finally found something steady, even if some old, tired part of me already had questions about how fast all of it had moved. I saw the room shift before I saw her. Conversations dipped by half a register, the way a crowd does when somebody worth noticing walks in. I turned, and there was Corinne, in a deep burgundy dress, silver hair pinned loose the way she wears it when she's had a long week and finally gets to breathe. Moving through that pavilion like she belonged in every room she'd ever entered, because she did. She found me easily. She always does. And she slid her hand into mine like it was the most natural motion in the world. "Sorry I'm late," she said, kissing my cheek. "Client meeting ran long. A widow finalizing paperwork on her late husband's estate. Didn't want to rush her out the door just because I had a party to get to. I should tell you properly who Corinne is, because it matters for everything that happens next. She spent 19 years as a fraud examiner for a regional bank oversight commission before she left to open her own practice here in Hendersonville, Elder Financial Protection, mostly helping seniors and recent widows recognize when somebody's gotten a little too close, a little too fast, to their retirement accounts. I met her about a year after my own divorce, at a job site where she'd stopped by in a consulting capacity for an elderly client whose furnace I was repairing, making sure nobody was overcharging the poor woman for parts she didn't need. She caught an invoice error I'd made in good faith and had me correct it before I even left the driveway. We didn't start dating for another 6 months after that. Neither of us was in a hurry, and I've come to believe that was exactly the right pace for two people who'd both been burned once by moving too fast toward things that looked right, instead of things that actually were. We married a 1.5 years ago. She never once needed me to prove my worth to her. She simply paid attention, the way she pays attention to everything, and decided for herself what she saw. "This is Corinne," I said to Diane and Roland, "my wife." "Walter," Diane said, recovering her composure with visible effort. "You didn't mention your wife," she paused, hunting for a word that wouldn't sound as transparent as it was so lovely. "You didn't ask," I said. "Not cruel, just true." Corinne extended her hand warmly to Diane, because that's who she is, gracious even to people who haven't earned it yet. Then she turned to Roland. Something in her face changed. Small, almost nothing. If you didn't know her the way I do, you'd have missed it entirely. A half-second flicker of recognition quickly smoothed back into a polite, professional smile. "Roland," she said, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," he said, already looking past her towards somebody more useful to talk to. Corinne didn't say a word about it right then, but I felt her fingers tighten just slightly around mine. I want to be honest with you, I hadn't come to that reunion expecting to be the center of anything. I'd come because Carl had spent 2 weeks telling me it was time to close a door I'd left cracked open, and because some quiet part of me wanted to walk back into that room one time, not as the man who'd been left, but simply as myself. What I hadn't planned on, what I genuinely hadn't seen coming, was the reunion committee chair, a classmate named Patricia Boone, stepping up to the small stage near the dessert table and tapping the microphone. "Before we get too far into the evening," Patricia said, "I want to do something I wasn't originally planning to do because I was asked to keep it quiet. But given some of what I've overheard tonight, I've changed my mind." My stomach dropped, because I already knew roughly where this was headed. "Most of you don't know this," she went on, "but this pavilion, the catering, the band, even the scholarship fund we're announcing tonight for graduating seniors at our old high school, all of it was fully underwritten by one of our own classmates who asked specifically to remain anonymous. He didn't want a toast, he didn't want a plaque, but I think our class ought to know who made tonight possible, and I think he ought to hear us say thank you out loud instead of behind his back." She looked directly across the room. Walter Hayes funded this entire reunion, and while I had the floor, I did a little digging, because I was curious. That same man quietly funded the new roof on the senior center on Chadwick Avenue last year. And he's the reason 18 kids from our old district have full scholarships to trade and technical programs through a fund named after his father. The applause that followed was real, and it went on longer than I was comfortable with. I stood there, with my hand raised in something between a wave and surrender, wishing the floor would open up while 90-some former classmates rearranged everything they thought they knew about me in real time. I watched Diane's face very closely in that moment, because I couldn't help it. The color left it slowly, like watching a porch light dim on a dimmer switch, instead of just flipping off. Her mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. Beside her, Roland's expression did something else entirely, a flicker of recalculation, fast and cold. The look of a man realizing he'd spent the whole evening standing next to the wrong person. "That's you," Diane finally managed, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "All of it. You paid for all of this." "I didn't want it to be about that," I said, and meant it. She had no response ready. For the first time all night, she didn't have one single thing to say. Here's the part of the story that turns this from a simple night of humbled pride into something with real weight, so stay with me. About 4 weeks before that reunion, 2 women had come separately to Corinne's practice asking for help. Both were recent widows. Both had met a charming, well-dressed man within weeks of losing their husbands. A man who talked fast about commercial lending and property deals, who moved the relationship toward engagement almost immediately, and who'd walked away from each of them with a 5-figure loan that simply evaporated the moment anyone asked for paperwork. Neither woman had a full name for him. One knew him only as Ray. The other had nothing but a first name and a grainy photo taken at a golf club fundraiser by a friend who'd thought it was funny at the time. Corinne had flagged the pattern immediately. It wasn't the first time she'd seen that exact playbook, and she'd already opened a file with an investigator she worked with regularly at the County Financial Crimes Division, cross-referencing the description against similar complaints from 2 neighboring counties. What she hadn't had, until that moment on the pavilion floor, was a face. Now she did. She didn't make a scene. She didn't say a single word to Diane that night beyond simple courtesy. That's not how Corinne operates, and it's part of why I love her the way I do. She excused herself about 20 minutes later, stepped out toward the parking lot, and sent a single text message to an investigator named Holt. "I think I just met Ray," she wrote. "Reunion Pavilion off Chadwick. Real name may be Roland Griggs. I'll call first thing tomorrow with everything." The next morning, Corinne sat at our kitchen table with her laptop, 2 case files, and a legal pad, and worked for 5 hours straight. She pulled the photo from the earlier complainant's file, compared it against a photo Carl had quietly taken at the reunion the night before without anybody noticing, and confirmed what she'd suspected in the parking lot. She drafted a formal statement, attached the corroborating details from both existing complainants, and filed everything with Investigator Holt's office by that afternoon. Not because of anything to do with Diane or me or the reunion at all, but because it was exactly the work she did every single week for people who had nobody else looking out for them. "This isn't about Diane," she told me that evening, and I believed her completely, because I know her. If it helps her too, fine, but I'd have filed this exact complaint if I'd met him at the hardware store. 3 days later, investigators obtained a warrant. They took Roland Griggs into custody outside his rental office on a Tuesday morning on charges connecting him to at least 4 victims across 3 counties, with investigators saying at the time they expected the number to grow once his lending records were fully unwound. Diane called me the night of the arrest. She was furious in a way I hadn't heard from her since the worst days near the end of our marriage. "You couldn't just let me have this one thing," she said, her voice shaking. "You had to make sure it happened at your wife's little practice. Y'all have been waiting to knock me down since the second I walked in that room with a ring on my finger. And this is how you handle it? You destroy him?" "Diane, don't," I said. "Don't act like this is some coincidence," she said. "Your wife's had it out for me since the moment she shook his hand." I saw her face. I didn't argue with her that night. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't hear reason yet, no matter how true the reason is, and I've learned the hard way that trying to force it usually just makes the wound angrier. I told her I was sorry she was in pain, and I meant it, and I let the call end there. 2 days after that, Investigator Holt called Diane directly as part of building the case and walked her through the full file. Bank statements showing the same lending pattern repeated with 5 different women in 14 months. Each one within months of a divorce or the death of a spouse. Each one moved toward engagement inside of 6 weeks. Messages from an entirely separate fiancé in Knoxville that Roland had been actively engaged to at the exact same time he'd proposed to Diane, a widow named Teresa, who'd been planning a wedding for that November, 300 miles away. Entirely unaware Diane existed. Photos from a storage unit full of watches, jewelry, one still in its original box, purchased with money that had come out of other women's settlements and estates, kept, investigators believed, as a kind of rotating inventory to regift to whichever woman he was courting next. Diane called me that same night, and this time there was no fury in her voice at all, just a kind of exhausted, hollowed-out quiet I recognized, because I'd worn that same quiet myself once a long time ago. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I said terrible things to you and to Corinne, and none of it was true, and I knew it wasn't true even while I was saying it. I just couldn't stand the idea that you two had been right about him, and that I'd been that easy to fool." "You weren't fooled because you're foolish," I told her. "You were fooled because he's very good at what he does, and because you'd just started over in a new place, looking for something steady, and he knew exactly how to find women in that exact moment and be whatever they needed him to be. That's not a character flaw in you, Diane. That's a crime he committed against you." She cried for a long while on the other end of the line, and I let her, because some things don't need fixing in the moment. They just need somebody willing to stay on the phone. "Will you tell Corinne I'm sorry?" she asked eventually. "Properly, not just through you. Tell her yourself," I said. "She'd want to hear it from you." Diane did call her 2 days later. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, and I never asked what was said. Some conversations belong only to the two people having them. About 3 weeks after that, Diane asked if she could take Dale and me to lunch. The three of us, nothing formal, just a diner near the old part of town. Corinne wasn't there, by design. Diane had asked separately if she could see her another time, one-on-one, and Corinne had said yes without hesitation. Lunch with Dale was easy, the way it usually is when your grown son is in the room to keep the adults from taking themselves too seriously. But near the end, when Dale stepped away to settle up at the register, Diane reached across the table and put her hand over mine briefly, the way she used to a long time ago. "I spent 2 years telling myself a story where I was fine and you were the one who'd stayed small," she said. "It was easier than admitting I'd traded something real for the idea of something impressive, and then gotten fooled by a worse version of the same mistake twice." "You're allowed to have gotten it wrong," I said. "Twice, even. That doesn't erase the good years, and it doesn't make you a fool. It just makes you somebody who was looking for something and hadn't found it yet." "Have you?" she asked. "Found it?" "Every ordinary morning," I told her. "That's usually where it's been hiding." She laughed at that, a real laugh, the first honest one I'd heard from her in a long time. And for the first time in 2 years, it didn't cost either of us anything to sit across a table from each other. The following week, she met Corinne for coffee near the practice downtown. Whatever was said between them, Corinne came home lighter than she'd been in days, and that was enough for me. I want to slow down here, because this next part matters more to me than anything else in this whole story. Dale is 31 now, married himself, working as a structural inspector down in Charlotte, a job he came to on his own, no help from me beyond the tools I'd taught him to use as a boy. About a week after the reunion, he called on a Wednesday evening, mostly to talk about nothing in particular, and near the end, mentioned almost as an afterthought, a grant his small inspection firm had received to fund continuing education for young engineers, something called the Everett Hayes Memorial Fund. "I looked it up," he said. "There's barely anything online. Just an old repair shop, and a mention in a newspaper archive about a bridge inspection he did the safety review on years back. That's your grandfather," I told him. "My father. He didn't talk about himself much. Wasn't really his way." "Runs in the family, huh?" he said, and I could hear the smile in it. I told him the truth then, about the fund, and why I'd never mentioned it. Why I'd wanted him to earn his own way into that career, because it was something he genuinely loved, not because of any name attached to it. "So, the firm didn't actually pick us because of you?" he asked, careful, like he was bracing for the grant to feel smaller now that he knew. "They picked your firm on its own record," I said quickly. "I made sure years ago the fund never touches applications directly, so nobody could ever say it happened because of who my father was." He was quiet a moment, a different kind of quiet this time. "Okay," he said, softer. "That actually means a lot more, knowing that. I want to end this story somewhere quieter than a pavilion, because that's where the truest parts of it actually live." Weeks later, once everything had finally settled, I stood on our back porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the ridge line a few miles off, the mountains doing that particular blue-gray they do in late autumn, a sky that hasn't decided anything yet. Corinne came out a few minutes later, wrapped in an old cardigan she refuses to replace no matter how many new ones I buy her, and handed me a second cup, even though I still had one going lukewarm in my other hand. A cold cup of coffee, she always says, is just a reminder to slow down, not a mistake to fix. Do you regret it? I asked her. Filing that complaint the moment you got home, on a night that was supposed to just be a party? She thought about it honestly before answering, because that's who she is. No, she said. I'd have filed it if I'd met him anywhere else, on any other night, attached to any other person. That's not a hard question for me, Walter. It never has been. She leaned her head against my shoulder. The hard part was watching Diane's face while I did it. I know what she is to you, even now. I didn't do it to hurt her. I did it because 4 other women needed somebody too. I know, I said. I've never once doubted that. We stood there a long while, coffee going lukewarm in our hands, watching the wind move slow through the trees below the ridge. Later that afternoon, I called Carl to thank him for pushing me to go that night. You knew, didn't you, I said, that something like this might happen. I didn't know the details, he said, laughing. I just knew you were finally ready to stop carrying all of it alone. Then, softer, your mother would have been proud of how you handled that room, Walter. Calm as still water. She used to tell me patience wasn't the same thing as standing still, I said. Most of us take 30 years to understand what our mothers said in about 10 seconds, Carl said, and I could hear the smile in it. That's just how wisdom works. It waits for you. If you've ever walked back into a room full of people who only remember the least finished version of you, I suspect you already know exactly what that evening felt like from where I was standing. And if you've ever quietly built something real while everyone around you assumed you were standing still, I hope this story gives you something to hold on to tonight. This story reminds me that real healing shows up in small, deliberate choices made quietly, long before anyone's applauding, and sometimes in the unglamorous, unhesitating work of somebody simply doing their job well without a single thought for who it might embarrass along the way. I didn't win that night because a room finally found out what I was worth. I won because I'd spent 2 quiet years building a life so steady it no longer needed a single person's approval to stand up straight on its own. And because I'd chosen, without ever quite planning to, a partner who did the right thing whether or not anybody was clapping for her. Diane didn't lose that night because she got embarrassed in front of her old classmates. She lost, for a little while, because she'd gone looking for a fresh start in the arms of the first man who told her exactly what she wanted to hear. What she found afterward, a son who still respected her, an ex-husband who didn't gloat, and a woman she'd been ready to call an enemy who fought for her without being asked, turned out to be worth more than that fresh start ever could have been. If you take one thing from my story tonight, friend, let it be this. The mistake most of us make is believing that other people's opinion of us, frozen at the worst or most unfinished chapter of our lives, is somehow more accurate than the life we've actually built. Ask yourself honestly tonight whether you're still measuring your own worth by a room that stopped paying attention to you years ago. That kind of peace, the quiet kind, is available to all of us. It's just built one ordinary morning at a time.